These days, it's almost impossible to watch an NBA game without seeing flopping or some form of foul baiting, and I'm not one of those people who think we should just accept it as part of the game now. I believe it's an issue that needs to be addressed because I don't like the direction the NBA is heading in that regard. Clearly, I'm not alone in this. Many players have faced criticism for excessive foul baiting, and one of the biggest names in that conversation is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Naturally, with the Thunder sitting at the top of the Western Conference and Shai in the MVP race, he's become a target. This season, he's been labeled a free throw merchant, which is far from a compliment. The term suggests that he relies on favorable calls from the refs, and he's only good because of the free throws and not his actual skill. And these aren't just random people saying this. It's even been repeated by some head coaches, particularly Chris Finch.
It's so frustrating to play this team because they foul a ton. You know, they really do. They foul all the time. And then, you can't really touch Shai.
This all happened after the Timberwolves beat the Thunder in overtime, a highly competitive, hard-fought game. In an era of the NBA where blowouts are common, we finally got an intense, high-stakes matchup. But instead of appreciating the game itself, the main focus of the night was SGA being labeled a free throw merchant. The crowd even started chanting it.
But this guy, to me, Mike, SGA, there's a maturity beyond his years. He's been in the driver's seat.
In that game, Shai attempted 20 free throws and made 11, and to many, it seemed like he was getting a favorable whistle. It's understandable why Timberwolves coach Chris Finch was frustrated, and he's not the only one. It's starting to feel like Shai has become the latest star player people love to hate. However, before jumping on the Shai slander train, let's take a step back and evaluate both sides of the argument. First, evidence that supports Shai not being a foul baiter and what makes him seem like he is. The first thing to consider is the sheer number of free throws he takes, which actually isn't as extreme as the outrage suggests. Based on the way people are talking, you'd think he was leading the league by a landslide, but in reality he doesn't. That title belongs to Giannis, who averages 10.3 free throws per game, while Shai ranks second at 8.9. Other high-profile names on the list include Anthony Davis, Trae Young, and even an aging James Harden. And look who else is in the top 10, Anthony Edwards. This makes Chris Finch's comments about how you can't touch Shai seem a bit hypocritical when Edwards himself gets over 6 free throw attempts per game. That brings us to the second point in Shai's defense. If you're going to call him a foul baiter, you have to apply that same label to a lot of other players, some of whom you may not want to admit belong in that category. Take Michael Jordan, for example. During his legendary 1986-87 season, when he averaged 37 points per game, he also attempted 12 free throws per game, more than Shai this season, but no one ever called Jordan a foul baiter. Now, before you flood the comments saying, "How dare you call Michael Jordan a free throw merchant?" let me clarify. I'm not just throwing that label on him because there's an even more important distinction to make. It's not just about the sheer number of free throws, but how a player gets them. Jordan likely earned those 12 attempts by aggressively attacking the rim and absorbing contact. Compare that to someone like Trae Young, who might get fewer free throws, say 8 or 9 per game, but earns them through tactics like stopping mid-drive or jumping backward into defenders to draw fouls. The method matters, and that's a real debate when it comes to Shai. Another point in Shai's favor is it's not like refs are just imagining contact when he drives. His defenders are actually fouling him. He's simply that good of a slasher that they just have to bail him out. Regardless of whether you think SGA is a free throw merchant or not, one thing is undeniable. Any player who attacks the rim as much as he does is naturally going to draw a lot of fouls. Shai leads the NBA in drives per game at 20.5, with Jalen Brunson second at 18.1 and Trae Young third at 17.1. Now think about it. Shai, Brunson, and Trae are all players who have been labeled as foul baiters. I've even heard people argue that Brunson shouldn't have been an all-star starter because, in their words, all he does is pump fake in the post or jab step until a defender bites so he can draw a foul. That criticism feels like it's going too far. But I'm not here to say whether these guys are foul baiters or not, at least not yet when it comes to Shai, because it's obvious that Trae Young is. But what stands out is that Shai's ability to get to the rim so frequently is a key part of his game, and that's worth considering before labeling him unfairly. At the end of the day, this debate isn't as black and white as people make it seem. There's a lot more nuance to consider. And speaking of nuance, that brings me to the main point I wanted to address in the more first half of the video where I've been defending Shea, and that is the MVP debate. When it comes to the MVP race, people tend to lose their minds. They start tearing down other players, exaggerating flaws, and creating false narratives. One of the most common arguments floating around is that Shea wouldn't even be in the MVP conversation if it weren't for his free throws. Critics point out that he generates about 8 points per game from free throws, while averaging 30 points overall, implying that without them, he'd only be a 24 point per game scorer. But that logic is completely flawed. First of all, if Shea suddenly stopped getting calls and the whistles weren't going his way, I firmly believe he would adapt. He has too many other tools in his arsenal: his ability to finish through contact, his footwork, and his mid-range game, including baseline jumpers. Take Chris Paul, for example. Remember when he used to rely on that rip-through move to bait defenders into fouls? Like if a defender stuck their arm out, CP3 would quickly rip through it and get a trip to the line? But would anyone seriously argue that he wouldn't be an all-time great point guard without that move? That would be a ridiculous claim. The reason that argument falls apart is because Chris Paul's greatness isn't defined by one tactic. He has elite playmaking and basketball IQ, and that's what makes him special. The same applies to Shea. If the NBA suddenly instructed referees to let more physicality slide by and call fewer fouls on his drives, would he have to adjust? Sure, but would that make him less effective? Probably not. He'd likely shift his approach, perhaps by taking more threes, refining his floater, or finding other ways to counter defenders who are now allowed to be more aggressive. He's just too skilled to be reduced to just the number of his free throws. On top of that, his main competition for MVP, Jokic, is also in the top 10 for free throw attempts, so I don't really understand the argument against Shea. It's unfair to single him out when plenty of other players could generate just as many points from free throws if they were as efficient as he is. Just because Shea converts his free throws at a 90% clip and therefore benefits more from his trips to the line than any other player who gets there just as often, doesn't mean one player deserves more criticism than the other. Now let's shift gears. I've defended Shea, but now I want to take a different perspective and share what I don't like about this situation. Let's just get it out there. NBA viewership is declining, and one of the biggest reasons has to be foul baiting. And don't even get me started on free throws. I get that they're a part of the game, but they are so boring to watch. The entire game comes to a halt, everyone has to line up and wait, and if it's someone like Giannis at the line, it feels like an eternity. He goes through his whole slow routine, shoots, high-fives his teammates, step backs, and then shoots again. The process is exhausting. There's nothing entertaining about free throws unless it's crunch time. To put into perspective how much I dislike watching them, I'll admit this. Sometimes if an NBA game is on, I'll opt to watch a past stream of a lower level college basketball game like D2 Hoops just so I can skip past the free throws, fast forward through timeouts, and avoid all the ads. But with a live NBA game, I don't get that luxury. At times, it feels like I'm watching more commercials and free throws than actual basketball. There was even a meme going around that every time you turn on a Thunder game, Shea is at the free throw line, and honestly, it feels kinda true. He gets there a lot, and this is an issue the NBA needs to address. Obviously, you can't just eliminate free throws or dramatically speed up the process, so the only real solution is to stop blowing the whistle as often. The league needs to let some of those calls slide. I don't care for these ticky-tack fouls. Now, to be completely transparent, that's my perspective as a fan. If I were an NBA player, I'd absolutely want those calls, because even the smallest fouls that seem unimportant to the refs still push the opposing team closer to the bonus. But I'm not an NBA player, so I'm just speaking my mind here. In my opinion, the NBA is becoming too high scoring. A lot of fans who grew up watching Michael Jordan and Larry Bird say the league has gone soft, especially on defense. But I don't think today's players are just worse defenders who can't slide their feet or contest shots. It's that the offensive skill, it's just gotten so much better and it's overall skyrocketed. Players are just too good. At this point, defenders need to be allowed to hand check more, use their bodies more, and get away with some blocking fouls. There's no reason why a game like the Grizzlies vs. the Suns should end with a score of 148-151. That's ridiculous. If Ja Morant had been allowed to hand check Devin Booker and use his body to control movement, the score wouldn't have been nearly that high. I truly believe the league needs to allow a little more physicality priority, because at this point it's a sign of respect for how skilled these players have become. Today's NBA requires such clean, almost perfect defense that we're constantly seeing absurdly high-scoring games, and that's on the NBA. This entire Shea situation is the NBA's fault too. Now that I've broken it all down, I'm ready to give my take. Yes, Shea is a free throw merchant, if that's what you want to call it, but so are a lot of other players, and honestly, I don't think that term should be viewed as entirely negative, because at the end of the day, it's the referees making the calls. If the league ever decides to flip the switch, Adam Silver and the officials could come together and agree to stop rewarding Shea Gilgeous-Alexander with certain calls, especially for those unnatural movements. That will put an end to the conversation, but until that day comes, let's stop calling Shea an unethical hooper. There is no moral code in basketball. If he can manipulate plays to earn free points, he's gonna do it, just like defenders who grab jerseys off the ball to fight through screens when the refs aren't looking. It's smart basketball, and sure, it might not always be pretty. Personally, I prefer watching Shea knock down step-back jumpers over watching him hunt for fouls, but from a basketball standpoint, drawing fouls helps him conserve energy. Expecting him to score 30 points a night purely on mid-range jumpers is unrealistic. Free throws help him stay efficient and keep his team competitive, so let's stop discrediting him, and let's also stop acting like there's some unwritten rulebook on how basketball should be played. Take Michael Jordan, for example. Everyone remembers Game 6 of the 1998 NBA Finals. Under 10 seconds left, MJ hit that legendary pullback jumper over Byron Russell to seal his 6th championship and second three-peat with the Bulls. But hold on, didn't Jordan clearly push off? That never gets mentioned when people talk about the so-called moral code of basketball. Why? Because it wasn't called, and you can't blame him for using a move that worked. It's the same with Shea. Even if his tactics are more noticeable and sometimes frustrating, he's simply taking advantage of what's allowed. Every trip to the free throw line benefits him and his team, and he's not going to feel bad about it. Just like Jordan's move worked, Shea's approach is working right now. But what do you think? Is SGA a free throw merchant, and is that a bad thing? Tell me in the comment section below. Until next time. Peace.